Hi everyone, welcome to session 5 of ServiceNow CIS IRM preparation. Now, in previous sessions, we have covered entity scoping, entity type. Now we'll talk about entity classes. So the question we are trying to answer as part of entity class creation is how to get risk and compliance posture for all business applications across all divisions in the business. That's the question we're trying to answer. So to get that answer, we need to configure entity classes. Entity classes are used to tag entities way to tag entities across different entity types. And classes can roll up into one another. For example, department, business application, business service, servers and databases. Now we will make use of GRC workbench to set up entity classes. So we look at GRC workbench. In order to navigate to GRC workbench, we'll use the keyword workbench, and under risk we have GRC workbench. So here we have an example. There is an organization and then there is business process. Again, there's an organization, then there's business process, there is system, and and then we have component. So this is one example. So there is, let's look at the navigation here. We have dependency model, entity types, and dependency map. So here, if you look at application, um, so look at this one here. So if I select, let's say, Microsoft Outlook as a business application, then we can see that it has upstream and downstream relationships uh, to this Acme Global Banking. And similarly, if I take an example of a business process, then this one has a lot of dependencies. Uh, for example, credit score verification is the process I've selected. It has upstream with inbound payment process, and then you have loan processing. Then it has downstream with locations, and then other entities, right? So that's how we can leverage this workbench to look at the upstream and downstream. So similarly, if I look at one NIST example, and if you're looking at an NIST process, then there is a sub-process and there is a sub-process again. And if I look at a department, for example, then this doesn't have any relationships. If I look at HR, then HR has, again, dependency to I think this is a business application and so on and so forth. So basically the idea is we can see a dependency map for a given entity here, and all the different entity classes are available here, like the company, department, facilities, and so on. Right? That's about that. And then you can also see the risk dependencies here. There's a tab for that. And there is a modal setup. So, okay, let's move on. We can also look at entity classes which are set up. So let's go to entity classes. It's part of policy compliance scoping section. The table name is SNGRC profile class. And here we can see application asset, business application, business capability, and so on. So again, for department, you can see that there's a class for that, and there's a parent class called company for that. It has child classes, which is business, service, and facility. So that is that. And it has 7 entities, right? And we also have option to associate a primary risk assessment methodology. So we'll talk about that in detail in next sessions. And then there's a tier also which we can map, right? So yeah, that's about that. Next, and based on this class, you will see that on the entity. For example, if I open this entity for department, then we can see that the class on that entity is department. So this comes based on this mapping that we are doing here. Next, we talk about tiers. So risks posture for most important items across all divisions in business. That's the use case. Then we have hierarchy levels associated to several classes, applies to all entities in that class. We can see how lower tiers entities are affecting higher tier entities. And any tier 1 class or entity will be upstream to tier 2 class and entities. Similarly, we have an example like business tier 1, application is tier 2, and IT asset is tier 3, and so on. The creation sequence, you start by creating tiers. As you can see here, in this example, we have application, business, and IT asset, 3 tiers. So based on what is mentioned here, business is tier 1, application is tier 2, IT asset is tier 3, right? And then you create class rules and classes, and then associate classes with tiers. So basically, we can come and associate, for example, business here like this. Save it. Right? That's how that is mapped. Then we have create types. So we create entity types, and then we create entity filters, which automatically creates entities. That's your sequence. So start by creating tiers, then create class rules and classes, associate classes with tiers, then you create entity types and entity filters, and then entities will get auto-created, and newly created entities get automatically tagged with the right class and tier. This can also be done manually. So which means if you want to map a class to an entity, that can be done. So for example, if I want to go to an entity and change the class on it, I can do that. Or if it's empty, then I can change it as well. That's that. Then next is how do we bring data for entities? So we need to identify data sources for entities, document uh, tier, class, and entity types. Run your entity scoping workshop to understand how do you scope the entities. Then entity scope definition, which is nothing but entity type, is related to specific risk statement, control objective relevant to their unique combination. Entity types contain financial data, is internet facing, contains customer data, for example. Like these are your some examples of entity types. Right? Next starting points, review regulations applicable to customer, places people things need to be compliant, role teams, business units are responsible. Uh, Describe existing framework used for controls and risks, review existing risk register and control library, define areas to audit slash current gaps and existing auditable units. So this comes as part of audit management. Then we have two approaches. One is operational approach. Scoping is done at specific CI level, individual user level, or project level. And there is strategic approach where it is done at services or business process level. Then entity generation to entity ownership. Determine which tables you should use when scoping. Research should, research source table data for accuracy and integrity. I mean, the idea is because the source data is critical for entity creation, we should ensure that it has all the right data and it has uh, the required attributes populated and so on. Now, entity filter, entity type, and entities. So core company, for example, is the filter, entity type is vendors, and hotel is an entity. Then you have department. The examples of department are HR and accounts. Then there is CMN underscore location, travel branches and travel branch locations, CMDBCS service, business services, payment handling is an example. Uh, then we have database instance and CTA databases, CTA primary or CTA replication. Then you have groups, SysUser group, senior travel consultant employees involved in pilot, and then there's that. We have CMDBCA groups, and so on. Then there is CMDBCA business process. So customer support is an entity type and payment handling. So basically we're talking about what is the table in ServiceNow and how it maps to a different entity type, right? And then there's the records in those tables, which becomes entities. So, so basically, what are core tables? The tables would start with either CMN or SIS or CORE. The next is system property, frequency of syncing entity owner to source record. So we can define like whether it is daily or weekly and so on. So the basic, according to this, the scheduled job that runs will pick up those records and it will sync them. Then entity filter and entity ownership sync. We have, as we have seen, like on the entity filter configuration, there is default owner, user owner fee, use owner field, source field for owner, auto update owner, empty owner, and then reference existing ServiceNow tables. Entity class is a requirement when using an entity filter. Uh, when record matches filter condition, entities will be created. When a record is no longer match entity conditions, one of the two will happen. So basically, Now, when once we define entity filter, then this talks about what happens with the entities. Right? So if the entities match the filter condition, then entities related to single entity type, all controls, risks and other related records will be set to retired, and then it becomes an active. Entities related to multiple entity types, only the records related to the entity type where the entity is no longer valid is retired, and the entities will not be inactivated. Right. So the idea is like depending on whether the entity types are many or one, accordingly the entity becomes deactivated or remains active, but the uh, and the controls and everything will get updated accordingly. So multiple filters can be defined for entity type. That's that. And then there is a scheduled job called GRC cleanup invalid entities. Delete entities that no longer active and will delete any other relevant records. Uh, on entity record, select auto update entity owner to keep it in sync with source record owner. So we have seen that. Next is entity classes again. So create entity class to show relationship between tables or objects you're tracking that otherwise don't exist elsewhere in ServiceNow, right? So that's the idea behind entity classes. Similar to tags stored in field on similar to tags stored in field on entity can be set up in a hierarchy, not related to entity types. So there is no relationship between entity type and entity class. Can be set up later in the implementation process. So this is not a first step; it can be done later as well. So entity type, entity filter, entity type are the first steps, but entity class is not. Next is entity management. Define roll-up of entities, controls, and risks. Regulatory change. Entity classes determine which entities can be assigned an impact assessment. Impact assessment helps determine if an event is applicable to the organization. Then in terms of RAM templates are defined for an entity class. So we're talking about where entity class is used in which space, right? So in case of RCM, regulatory change management, entity class determine which entities can be assigned as an impact assessment. And in case of RAM, they are defined at an entity class level. Next is taxonomy, which is categorization. So it can be company org structure, cost center structure, business capabilities, business strategies, or business services, internal service provider. Like these are some examples. Whether it is an internal service provider, business services, or service provider to customers. Then there's business processes, then there's geolocation, and so on. Then there is entity class configuration, so set up classes, entity class rule, run only on new entities, manual update, and so on. And then this GRC workbench dependency model, only available in classic UI, build relationship between entity classes. Not all business services will roll up to all departments. Use dependency map to create specific relationship. So again, the idea is if you want to specifically create relationship between different entities, then you can use the workbench for that. So that's a dependency map we talked about. And then, for example, if you want to if you have a use case where not all business apps, business services will roll up to all departments, then you can define that specifically by using the dependency map, the GRC workbench. And entity class are used to create upstream and downstream relationships. So that we have seen on an entity here, if you see the upstream and downstream relationships are, so here the upstream and downstream relationships, these are coming from based on entity class configuration. And entity type does not allow data to be rolled up into different structures. So the one of the reasons why we need entity class is because entity type doesn't have the capability to do a roll up of data into a different structure, which is why we use entity class. And okay, next we move on to other topics, but we'll cover them in next sessions. Thank you.